The Story of Civilization, Volume 1, Our Oriental Heritage, Part 1, by Will Durant. Continued, Cassette 6, Side 2. More popular were the animal gods. They were so numerous that they filled the Egyptian pantheon like a chattering menagerie. In one nome or another, in one period or another, Egyptians worshipped the bull, the crocodile, the hawk, the cow, the goose, the goat, the ram, the cat, the dog, the chicken, the swallow, the jackal, the serpent, and allowed some of these creatures to roam in the temples with the same freedom that is accorded to the sacred cow in India today. When the gods became human, they still retained animal doubles and symbols. Ammon was represented as a goose or a ram, Ra as a grasshopper or a bull, Osiris as a bull or a ram, Sebek as a crocodile, Horus as a hawk or falcon, Hathor as a cow, and Thoth, the god of wisdom, as a baboon. Sometimes women were offered to certain of these animals as sexual mates. The bull in particular, as the incarnation of Osiris, received this honor. And at Mendes, says Plutarch, the most beautiful women were offered in coitus to the divine goat. From beginning to end, this totemism remained as an essential and native element in Egyptian religion. Human gods came to Egypt much later, and probably as gifts from Western Asia. The goat and the bull were especially sacred to the Egyptians as representing sexual creative power. They were not merely symbols of Osiris, but incarnations of him. Often Osiris was depicted with large and prominent organs as a mark of his supreme power, and models of him in this form, or with a triple phallus, were borne in religious processions by the Egyptians. On certain occasions the women carried such phallic images and operated them mechanically with strings. Signs of sex worship appear not only in the many cases in which figures are depicted on temple reliefs with erect organs, but in the frequent appearance in Egyptian symbolism of the crux ansata, a cross with a handle, as a sign of sexual union and vigorous life. At last the gods became human, or rather men became gods. Like the deities of Greece, the personal gods of Egypt were merely superior men and women, made in heroic mold, but composed of bone and muscle, flesh and blood. They hungered and ate, thirsted and drank, loved and mated, hated and killed, grew old and died. There was Osiris, for example, god of the beneficent Nile, whose death and resurrection were celebrated yearly as symbolizing the fall and rise of the river, and perhaps the decay and growth of the soil. Every Egyptian of the later dynasties could tell the story of how Set, or Sit, the wicked god of desiccation, who shriveled up harvests with his burning breath, was angered at Osiris, the Nile, for extending with his overflow the fertility of the earth, slew him and reigned in dry majesty over Osiris's kingdom, that is, the river once failed to rise, until Horus, brave son of Isis, overcame Set and banished him, whereafter Osiris, brought back to life by the warmth of Isis's love, ruled benevolently over Egypt, suppressed cannibalism, established civilization, and then ascended to heaven to reign there endlessly as a god. It was a profound myth, for history, like Oriental religion, is dualistic, a record of the conflict between creation and destruction, fertility and desiccation, rejuvenation and exhaustion, good and evil, life and death. Profound, too, was the myth of Isis, the Great Mother. She was not only the loyal sister and wife of Osiris. In a sense, she was greater than he, for, like woman in general, she had conquered death through love. Nor was she merely the black soil of the delta, fertilized by the touch of Osiris Nile, and making all Egypt rich with her fecundity. She was, above all, the symbol of that mysterious creative power which had produced the earth and every living thing, and of that maternal tenderness whereby, at whatever cost to the mother, the young new life is nurtured to maturity. She represented in Egypt, as Kali, Ishtar, and Cybele represented in Asia, Demeter in Greece, and Ceres in Rome, the original priority and independence of the female principle in creation and in inheritance, and the originative leadership of woman in tilling the earth. For it was Isis, said the myth, who had discovered wheat and barley growing wild in Egypt, and had revealed them to Osiris, man. The Egyptians worshipped her with special fondness and piety, and raised up jeweled images to her as the mother of God. Her tonsured priests praised her in sonorous matins and vespers, and in midwinter of each year, coincident with the annual rebirth of the sun towards the end of our December, the temples of her divine child, Horus, god of the sun, showed her in holy effigy nursing in a stable the babe that she had miraculously conceived. These poetic philosophic legends and symbols profoundly affected Christian ritual and theology. Early Christians sometimes worshipped before the statues of Isis suckling the infant Horus, seeing in them another form of the ancient and noble myth by which woman, that is the female principle, creating all things, becomes at last the mother of God. These, Ra, or as he was called in the south, Ammon, Osiris, Isis, and Horus, were the greater gods of Egypt. In later days, Ra, Ammon, and another god, Ptah, were combined as three embodiments or aspects of one supreme and triune deity. There were countless lesser divinities: Anubis the jackal, Shu, Tefnut, Nephthys, Ket, Nut. But we must not make these pages a museum of dead gods. Even Pharaoh was a god, always the son of Ammon-Ra, ruling not merely by divine right but by divine birth, as a deity transiently tolerating the earth as his home. On his head was the falcon, symbol of Horus and totem of the tribe. From his forehead rose the uraeus, or serpent, symbol of wisdom and life, and communicating magic virtues to the crown. The king was chief priest of the faith, and led the great processions and ceremonies that celebrated the festivals of the gods. It was through this assumption of divine lineage and powers that he was able to rule so long with so little force. Hence the priests of Egypt were the necessary props of the throne and the secret police of the social order. Given a faith of such complexity, a class had to arise adept in magic and ritual, whose skill would make it indispensable in approaching the gods. In effect, though not in law, the office of priest passed down from father to son, and a class grew up which, through the piety of the people and the politic generosity of the kings, became in time richer and stronger than the feudal aristocracy or the royal family itself. The sacrifices offered to the gods supplied the priests with food and drink. The temple buildings gave them spacious homes. The revenues of temple lands and services furnished them with ample incomes, and their exemption from forced labor, military service, and ordinary taxation left them in an enviable position of prestige and power. They deserved not a little of this power, for they accumulated and preserved the learning of Egypt, educated the youth, and disciplined themselves with rigor and zeal. Herodotus describes them almost with awe. They are of all men the most excessively attentive to the worship of the gods, and observe the following ceremonies. They wear linen garments, constantly fresh-washed. They are circumcised for the sake of cleanliness, thinking it better to be clean than handsome. They shave their whole body every third day, that neither lice nor any other impurity may be found upon them. They wash themselves in cold water twice every day and twice every night. What distinguished this religion above everything else was its emphasis on immortality. If Osiris, the Nile, and all vegetation might rise again, so might man. The amazing preservation of the dead body in the dry soil of Egypt lent some encouragement to this belief, which was to dominate Egyptian faith for thousands of years, and to pass from it by its own resurrection into Christianity. The body, Egypt believed, was inhabited by a small replica of itself called the Ka, and also by a soul that dwelt in the body like a bird flitting among trees. All of these, body, Ka, and soul, survived the appearance of death. They could escape mortality for a time in proportion as the flesh was preserved from decay. But if they came to Osiris clean of all sin, they would be permitted to live forever in the happy field of food, those heavenly gardens where there would always be abundance and security. Judge the harassed penury that spoke in this consoling dream. These Elysian fields, however, could be reached only through the services of a ferryman, an Egyptian prototype of Charon. And this old gentleman would receive into his boat only such men and women as had done no evil in their lives. Or Osiris would question the dead, weighing each candidate's heart in the scale against a feather to test his truthfulness. Those who failed in this final examination would be condemned to lie forever in their tombs, hungering and thirsting, fed upon by hideous crocodiles, and never coming forth to see the sun. According to the priests, there were clever ways of passing these tests, and they offered to reveal these ways for a consideration. One was to fit up the tomb with food, drink, and servants to nourish and help the dead. Another was to fill the tomb with talismans pleasing to the gods, fish, vultures, snakes, above all the scarab, a beetle which, because it reproduced itself apparently with fertilization, typified the resurrected soul. If these were properly blessed by a priest, they would frighten away every assailant and annihilate every evil. A still better way was to buy the Book of the Dead, scrolls for which the priests had written prayers, formulas, and charms calculated to appease even to deceive Osiris. When, after 100 vicissitudes and perils, the dead soul at last reached Osiris, it was to address the great judge in some such manner as this: O thou who speedest time's advancing wing, thou dweller in all mysteries of life, thou guardian of every word I speak, behold, thou art ashamed of me, thy son. Thy heart is full of sorrow and of shame, for that my sins were grievous in the world, and proud my wickedness and my transgression. O be at peace with me, O be at peace, and break the barriers that loom between us. Let all my sins be washed away, and fall forgotten to the right and left of thee. Yea, do away with all my wickedness, and put away the shame that fills thy heart, that thou and I henceforth may be at peace. Or the soul was to declare its innocence of all major sins in a negative confession that represents for us one of the earliest and noblest expressions of the moral sense in man. Hail to thee, great God, Lord of truth and justice! I have come before thee, my master. I have been brought to see thy beauties. I bring unto you truth. I have not committed iniquity against men. I have not oppressed the poor. I have not laid labor upon any free man beyond that which he wrought for himself. I have not defaulted. I have not committed that which is an abomination to the gods. I have not caused the slave to be ill-treated of his master. I have not starved any man. I have not made any to weep. I have not assassinated any man. I have not committed treason against any. I have not in aught diminished the supplies of the temple. I have not spoiled the showbread of the gods. I have done no carnal act within the sacred enclosure of the temple. I have not blasphemed. I have not falsified the balance. I have not taken away milk from the mouths of sucklings. I have not taken with nets the birds of the gods. I am pure, I am pure, I am pure. For the most part, however, Egyptian religion had little to say about morality. The priests were busier selling charms, mumbling incantations, and performing magic rites than inculcating ethical precepts. Even the Book of the Dead teaches the faithful that charms blessed by the clergy will overcome all the obstacles that the deceased soul may encounter on its way to salvation. And the emphasis is rather on reciting the prayers than on living the good life. Says one roll, "If this can be known by the deceased, he shall come forth by day," that is, rise to eternal life. Amulets and incantations were designed and sold to cover a multitude of sins and secure the entrance of the devil himself into paradise. At every step the pious Egyptian had to mutter strange formulas to avert evil and attract the good. Here, for example, an anxious mother trying to drive out demons from her child. "Run out, thou who comest in darkness, who enterest in stealth. Comest thou to kiss this child? I will not let thee kiss him. Comest thou to take him away? I will not let thee take him away from me. I have made his protection against thee out of ephet herb, which makes pain, out of onions which harm thee, out of honey which is sweet to the living and bitter to the dead, out of the evil parts of the ebdu fish, out of the backbone of the perch." The gods themselves used magic and charms against one another. The literature of Egypt is full of magicians, of wizards who dry up lakes with a word, or cause severed limbs to jump back into place, or raise the dead. The king had magicians to help or guide him, and he himself was believed to have a magical power to make the rain fall or the river rise. Life was full of talismans, spells, divinations. Every door had to have a god to frighten away evil spirits or fortuitous strokes of bad luck. Children born on the 23rd of the month of Thoth would surely die soon. Those born on the 20th of Choyak would go blind. Each day and month, says Herodotus, is assigned to some particular god, and according to the day on which each person is born, they determine what will befall him, how he will die, and what kind of person he will be. In the end, the connection between morality and religion tended to be forgotten. The road to eternal bliss led not through a good life, but through magic, ritual, and generosity to the priests. Let a great Egyptologist express the matter. The dangers of the hereafter were now greatly multiplied, and for every critical situation the priest was able to furnish the dead with an effective charm which would infallibly cure him. Besides many charms which enabled the dead to reach the world of the hereafter, there were those which prevented him from losing his mouth, his head, his heart, others which enabled him to remember his name, to breathe, eat, drink, avoid eating his own foulness, to prevent his drinking water from turning into flame, to turn darkness into light, to ward off all serpents and other hostile monsters, and many others. Thus the earliest moral development which we can trace in the ancient East was suddenly arrested, or at least checked, by the detestable devices of a corrupt priesthood eager for gain. Such was the state of religion in Egypt when Ikhnaton, poet and heretic, came to the throne and inaugurated the religious revolution that destroyed the empire of Egypt. 4. The Heretic King. The character of Ikhnaton, the new religion, a hymn to the sun, monotheism, the new dogma, the new art, reaction, Nefertiti, breakup of the empire, death of Ikhnaton. In the year 1380 B.C., Amenhotep III, who had succeeded Thutmose III, died after a life of worldly luxury and display, and was followed by his son, Amenhotep IV, destined to be known as Ikhnaton. A profoundly revealing portrait bust of him, discovered at Tel el Amarna, shows a profile of incredible delicacy, a face feminine in softness and poetic in its sensitivity, large eyelids like a dreamer's, a long misshapen skull, a frame slender and weak. Here was a Shelley called to be a king. He had hardly come to power when he began to revolt against the religion of Ammon and the practices of Ammon's priests. In the great temple at Karnak, there was now a large harem, supposedly the concubines of Ammon, but in reality serving to amuse the clergy. The young emperor, whose private life was a model of fidelity, did not approve of this sacred harlotry. The blood of the ram slaughtered in sacrifice to Ammon stank in his nostrils, and the traffic of the priests in magic and charms, and their use of the oracle of Ammon to support religious obscurantism and political corruption, disgusted him to the point of violent protest. "More evil are the words of the priests," he said, "than those which I heard until the year 4 of his reign. More evil are they than those which King Amenhotep III heard." His youthful spirit rebelled against the sordidness into which the religion of his people had fallen. He abominated the indecent wealth and lavish ritual of the temples, and the growing hold of a mercenary hierarchy on the nation's life. With a poet's audacity, he threw compromise to the winds and announced bravely that all these gods and ceremonies were a vulgar idolatry, that there was but one god, Aton. Like Akbar in India 30 centuries later, Ikhnaton saw divinity above all in the sun, in the source of all earthly life and light. We cannot tell whether he had adopted his theory from Syria, and whether Aton was merely a form of Adonis. Of whatever origin, the new god filled the king's soul with delight. He changed his own name from Amenhotep, which contained the name of Ammon, to Ikhnaton, meaning Aton is satisfied. And helping himself with old hymns and certainly monotheistic poems published in the preceding reign, he composed passionate songs to Aton, of which this, the longest and the best, is the fairest surviving remnant of Egyptian literature. Thy dawning is beautiful in the horizon of the sky, O living Aton, beginning of life. When thou risest in the eastern horizon, thou fillest every land with thy beauty. Thou art beautiful, great, glittering, high above every land. Thy rays, they encompass the land, even all that thou hast made. Thou art Ray, and thou carriest them all away captive. Thou bindest them by thy love. Though thou art far away, thy rays are upon earth. Though thou art on high, thy footprints are the day. When thou settest in the western horizon of the sky, the earth is in darkness like the dead. They sleep in their chambers, their heads are wrapped up, their nostrils are stopped, and none seeth the other. All their things are stolen which are under their heads, and they know it not. Every lion cometh forth from his den, all serpents they sting. The world is in silence, he that made them resteth in his horizon. Bright is the earth when thou risest in the horizon. When thou shinest as Aton by day, thou drivest away the darkness. When thou sendest forth thy rays, the two lands are in daily festivity, awake and standing upon their feet when thou hast raised them up. Their limbs bathed, they take their clothing, their arms uplifted in adoration to thy dawning. In all the world they do their work. All cattle rest upon their pasturage, the trees and the plants flourish, the birds flutter in their marshes, their wings uplifted in adoration to thee. All the sheep dance upon their feet, all winged things fly. They live when thou hast shone upon them. The barks sail upstream and downstream. Every highway is open because thou dawnest. The fish in the river leap up before thee. Thy rays are in the midst of the great green sea. Creator of the germ in woman, maker of seed in man, giving life to the son in the body of his mother, soothing him that he may not weep, nurse even in the womb, giver of breath to animate every one that he maketh. When he cometh forth from the body on the day of his birth, thou openest his mouth in speech, thou suppliest his necessities. When the fledgling in the egg chirps in the egg, thou givest him breath therein to preserve him alive. When thou hast brought him together to the point of bursting the egg, he cometh forth from the egg to chirp with all his might. He goeth about upon his 2 feet, when he hath come forth therefrom. How manifold are thy works! They are hidden from before us, O sole God, whose powers no other possesseth. Thou didst create the earth according to thy heart, while thou wast alone. Men, all cattle large and small, all that are upon the earth, that go about upon their feet, all that are on high that fly with their wings, the foreign countries, Syria and Cush, the land of Egypt. Thou settest every man into his place. Thou suppliest their necessities. Thou makest the Nile in the nether world. Thou bringest it as thou desirest, to preserve alive the people. How excellent are thy designs, O Lord of eternity! There is a Nile in the sky for the strangers and for the cattle of every country that go upon their feet. Thy rays nourish every garden. When thou risest, they live, they grow by thee. Thou makest the seasons in order to create all thy work, winter to bring them coolness, and heat that they may taste thee. Thou didst make the distant sky to rise therein, in order to behold all that thou hast made, thou alone, shining in the form as living Aton. Dawning, glittering, going afar and returning. Thou makest millions of forms through thyself alone, cities, towns, and tribes, highways and rivers. All eyes see thee before them, for thou art Aton of the day over the earth. Thou art in my heart. There is no other that knoweth thee, save thy son Ichnaton. Thou hast made him wise in thy designs and in thy might. The world is in thy hand, even as thou hast made them. When thou hast risen, they live. When thou settest, they die. For thou art length of life of thyself. Men live through thee, while their eyes are upon thy beauty until thou settest. All labor is put away when thou settest in the west. Thou didst establish the world, and raised them up for thy son, Ichnaton, whose life is long, and for the chief royal wife, his beloved, mistress of the 2 lands, Nefer-Nefru Aton, Nefertiti, living and flourishing forever and ever. This is not only one of the great poems of history. It is the first outstanding expression of monotheism, 700 years before Isaiah. Perhaps, as Breasted suggests, this conception of one sole God was a reflex of the unification of the Mediterranean world under Egypt by Thutmose III. Ichnaton conceives his God as belonging to all nations equally, and even names other countries before his own as in Aton's care. This was an astounding advance upon the old tribal deities. Note the vitalistic conception. Aton is to be found not in battles and victories, but in flowers and trees, in all forms of life and growth. Aton is the joy that causes the young sheep to dance upon their legs and the birds to flutter in their marshes. Nor is the god a person limited to human form. The real divinity is the creative and nourishing heat of the sun. The flaming glory of the rising or setting orb is but an emblem of that ultimate power. Nevertheless, because of its omnipresent fertilizing beneficence, the sun becomes to Ichnaton also the Lord of love, the tender nurse that creates the man-child in woman and fills the 2 lands of Egypt with love. So at last Aton grows by symbolism into a solicitous father, compassionate and tender, not like Yahweh, a lord of hosts, but a god of gentleness and peace. It is one of the tragedies of history that Ichnaton, having achieved his elevating vision of universal unity, was not satisfied to let the noble quality of his new religion slowly win the hearts of men. He was unable to think of his truth in relative terms. The thought came to him that other forms of belief and worship were indecent and intolerable. Suddenly he gave orders that the names of all gods but Aton should be erased and chiseled from every public inscription in Egypt. He mutilated his father's name from 100 monuments to cut from it the word Ammon. He declared all creeds but his own illegal and commanded that all the old temples should be closed. He abandoned Thebes as unclean and built for himself a beautiful new capital at Akhet-Aton, city of the horizon of Aton. Rapidly Thebes decayed as the offices and emoluments of government were taken from it, and Akhet-Aton became a rich metropolis, busy with fresh building and a renaissance of arts liberated from the priestly bondage of tradition. The joyous spirit expressed in the new religion passed over into its art. At Tel El Amarna, a modern village on the site of Akhet-Aton, Sir William Flinders Petrie unearthed a beautiful pavement adorned with birds, fishes, and other animals painted with the most delicate grace. Ichnaton forbade the artists to make images of Aton on the lofty ground that the true god has no form. For the rest, he left art free, merely asking his favorite artists, Beck, Auta, and Nutmos, to describe things as they saw them and to forget the conventions of the priests. They took him at his word and represented him as a youth of gentle, almost timid face and strangely dolichocephalic head. Taking their lead from his vitalistic conception of deity, they painted every form of plant and animal life with loving detail and with a perfection hardly surpassed in any other place or time. For a while, art, which in every generation knows the pangs of hunger and obscurity, flourished in abundance and happiness. Had Ikhnaton been a mature mind, he would have realized that the change which he had proposed from a superstitious polytheism, deeply rooted in the needs and habits of the people, to a naturalistic monotheism that subjected imagination to intelligence, was too profound to be effected in a little time. He would have made haste slowly and softened the transition with intermediate steps. But he was a poet rather than a philosopher. Like Shelley announcing the demise of Yahweh to the bishops of Oxford, he grasped for the absolute and brought the whole structure of Egypt down upon his head. At one blow he had dispossessed and alienated a wealthy and powerful priesthood, and had forbidden the worship of deities made dear by long tradition and belief. When he had Ammon hacked out from his father's name, it seemed to his people a blasphemous impiety. Nothing could be more vital to them than the honoring of the ancestral dead. He had underestimated the strength and pertinacity of the priests, and he had exaggerated the capacity of the people to understand a natural religion. Behind the scenes, the priests plotted and prepared, and in the seclusion of their homes the populace continued to worship their ancient and innumerable gods. 100 crafts that had depended upon the temples muttered in secret against the heretic. Even in his palace his ministers and generals hated him and prayed for his death, for was he not allowing the empire to fall to pieces in his hands? Meanwhile, the young poet lived in simplicity and trust. He had 7 daughters, but no son, and though by law he might have sought an heir by his secondary wives, he would not, but preferred to remain faithful to Nofreteti. A little ornament has come down to us that shows him embracing the queen. He allowed artists to depict him riding in a chariot through the streets, engaged in pleasantries with his wife and children. On ceremonial occasions the queen sat beside him and held his hand, while their daughters frolicked at the foot of the throne. He spoke of his wife as mistress of his happiness, at hearing whose voice the king rejoices, and for an oath he used the phrase, "As my heart is happy in the queen and her children." It was a tender interlude in Egypt's epic of power. Into this simple happiness came alarming messages from Syria. The dependencies of Egypt in the Near East were being invaded by Hittites and other neighboring tribes. The governors appointed by Egypt pleaded for immediate reinforcements. Ikhnaton hesitated. He was not quite sure that the right of conquest warranted him in keeping these states in subjection to Egypt, and he was loath to send Egyptians to die on distant fields for so uncertain a cause. When the dependencies saw that they were dealing with a saint, they deposed their Egyptian governors, quietly stopped all payment of tribute, and became to all effects free. Almost in a moment Egypt ceased to be a vast empire and shrank back into a little state. Soon the Egyptian treasury, which had for a century depended upon foreign tribute as its mainstay, was empty. Domestic taxation had fallen to a minimum, and the working of the gold mines had stopped. Internal administration was in chaos. Ikhnaton found himself penniless and friendless in a world that had seemed all his own. Every colony was in revolt, and every power in Egypt was arrayed against him, waiting for his fall. He was hardly 30 when, in 1362 B.C., he died, broken with the realization of his failure as a ruler and the unworthiness of his race. 5. Decline and Fall. Tutankhamun, the labors of Ramesses II, the wealth of the clergy, the poverty of the people, the conquest of Egypt, summary of Egyptian contributions to civilization. 2 years after his death, his son-in-law, Tutankhamun, a favorite of the priests, ascended the throne. He changed the name of Tutankhaten, which his father-in-law had given him, returned the capital to Thebes, made his peace with the powers of the church, and announced to a rejoicing people the restoration of the ancient gods. The words Aton and Ikhnaton were effaced from all the monuments, the priests forbade the name of the heretic king to pass any man's lips, and the people referred to him as the great criminal. The names that Ikhnaton had removed were recarved upon the monuments, and the feast days that he had abolished were renewed. Everything was as before. For the rest, Tutankhamun reigned without distinction. The world would hardly have heard of him had not unprecedented treasures been found in his grave. After him, a doughty general, Harmhab, marched his armies up and down the coast, restoring Egypt's external power and internal peace. Seti I wisely reaped the fruits of renewed order and wealth, built the hypostyle hall at Karnak, began to cut a mighty temple into the cliffs at Abu Simbel, commemorated his grandeur in magnificent reliefs, and had the pleasure of lying for thousands of years in one of the most ornate of Egypt's tombs. At this point the romantic Ramesses II, last of the great pharaohs, mounted the throne. Seldom is history known so picturesque a monarch. Handsome and brave, he added to his charms by his boyish consciousness of them, and his exploits in war, which he never tired of recording, were equaled only by his achievements in love. After brushing aside a brother who had inopportune rights to the throne, he sent an expedition to Nubia to tap the gold mines there and replenish the treasury of Egypt, and with the resultant funds he undertook the reconquest of the Asiatic provinces, which had again rebelled. 3 years he gave to recovering Palestine. Then he pushed on, met a great army of the Asiatic allies at Kadesh, 1288 B.C., and turned defeat into victory by his courage and leadership. It may have been as a result of these campaigns that a considerable number of Jews were brought into Egypt as slaves or as immigrants, and Ramesses II is believed to have been the pharaoh of the Exodus. He had his victories commemorated, without undue impartiality, on 100 walls, commissioned a poet to celebrate him in epic verse, and rewarded himself with several hundred wives. When he died, he left 100 sons and 50 daughters to testify to his quality by their number and their proportion. He married several of his daughters, so that they too might have splendid children. His offspring were so numerous that they constituted for 400 years a special class in Egypt, from which for over a century her rulers were chosen. He deserved these consolations, for he seems to have ruled Egypt well. He built so lavishly that half the surviving edifices of Egypt are ascribed to his reign. He completed the main hall at Karnak, added to the temple of Luxor, raised his own vast shrine, the Ramesseum, west of the river, finished the great mountain sanctuary at Abu Simbel, and scattered colossi of himself throughout the land. Commerce flourished under him, both across the Isthmus of Suez and on the Mediterranean. He built another canal from the Nile to the Red Sea, but the shifting sands filled it up soon after his death. He yielded up his life in 1225 B.C., aged 90, after one of the most remarkable reigns of history. Only one human power in Egypt had excelled his, and that was the clergy. Here, as everywhere in history, ran the endless struggle between church and state. Throughout his reign and those of his immediate successors, the spoils of every war and the lion's share of taxes from the conquered provinces went to the temples and the priests. These reached the zenith of their wealth under Ramesses III. They possessed at that time 107,000 slaves, 1/30th of the population of Egypt. They held 750,000 acres, 1/7 of all the arable land. They owned 500,000 head of cattle. They received the revenues from 169 towns in Egypt and Syria, and all this property was exempt from taxation. The generous or timorous Ramesses III showered unparalleled gifts upon the priests of Ammon, including 32,000 kilograms of gold and 1,000,000 kilograms of silver. Every year he gave them 185,000 sacks of corn. When the time came to pay the workmen employed by the state, he found his treasury empty. More and more the people starved in order that the gods might eat. Under such a policy it was only a matter of time before the kings would become the servants of the priests. In the reign of the last Ramesside king, the high priest of Ammon usurped the throne and ruled as openly supreme. The empire became a stagnant theocracy, in which architecture and superstition flourished, and every other element in the national life decayed. Omens were manipulated to give a divine sanction to every decision of the clergy. The most vital forces of Egypt were sucked dry by the thirst of the gods at the very time when foreign invaders were preparing to sweep down upon all this concentrated wealth. For meanwhile on every frontier trouble brewed. The prosperity of the country had come in part from its strategic place on the main line of Mediterranean trade. Its metals and wealth had given it mastery over Libya on the west, and over Phoenicia, Syria, and Palestine on the north and east. But now at the other end of this trade route, in Assyria, Babylon, and Persia, new nations were growing to maturity and power, were strengthening themselves with invention and enterprise, and were daring to compete in commerce and industry with the self-satisfied and pious Egyptians. The Phoenicians were perfecting the trireme galley, and with it were gradually wresting from Egypt the control of the sea. The Dorians and Achaeans had conquered Crete and the Aegean, circa 1400 B.C., and were establishing a commercial empire of their own. Trade moved less and less in slow caravans over the difficult and robber-infested mountains and deserts of the Near East. It moved more and more at less expense and with less loss in ships that passed through the Black Sea and the Aegean to Troy, Crete, and Greece, at last to Carthage, Italy, and Spain. The nations along the northern shores of the Mediterranean ripened and blossomed. The nations on the southern shores faded and rotted away. Egypt lost her trade, her gold, her power, her art, at last even her pride. One by one her rivals crept down upon her soil, harassed and conquered her, and laid her waste. In 954 B.C. the Libyans came in from the western hills and laid about them with fury. In 722 the Ethiopians entered from the south and avenged their ancient slavery. In 674 the Assyrians swept down from the north and subjected priest-ridden Egypt to tribute. For a time, Psamtik, prince of Sais, repelled the invaders and brought Egypt together again under his leadership. During his long reign and those of his successors came the Saite revival of Egyptian art. The architects and sculptors, poets and scientists of Egypt gathered up the technical and aesthetic traditions of their schools and prepared to lay them at the feet of the Greeks. But in 525 B.C. the Persians, under Cambyses, crossed Suez and again put an end to Egyptian independence. In 332 B.C. Alexander sallied out of Asia and made Egypt a province of Macedon. In 48 B.C. Caesar arrived to capture Egypt's new capital, Alexandria, and to give to Cleopatra the son and heir whom they vainly hoped to crown as the unifying monarch of the greatest empires of antiquity. In 30 B.C. Egypt became a province of Rome and disappeared from history. For a time it flourished again when saints peopled the desert, and Cyril dragged Hypatia to her death in the streets, 415 A.D., and again when the Moslems conquered it, circa A.D. 650, built Cairo with the ruins of Memphis, and filled it with bright-domed mosques and citadels. But these were alien cultures, not really Egypt's own, and they too passed away. Today there is a place called Egypt, but the Egyptian people are not masters there. Long since they have been broken by conquest and merged in language and marriage with their Arab conquerors. Their cities know only the authority of Moslems and Englishmen, and the feet of weary pilgrims who travel thousands of miles to find that the pyramids are merely heaps of stones. Perhaps greatness could grow there again if Asia should once more become rich and make Egypt the halfway house of the planet's trade. But of the morrow, as Lorenzo sang, there is no certainty. Today the only certainty is decay. On all sides gigantic ruins, monuments and tombs, memorials of a savage and titanic energy. On all sides poverty and desolation and the exhaustion of an ancient blood. And on all sides the hostile engulfing sands, blown about forever by hot winds and grimly resolved to cover everything in the end. Nevertheless, the sands have destroyed only the body of ancient Egypt. Its spirit survives in the lore and memory of our race. The improvement of agriculture, metallurgy, industry and engineering, the apparent invention of glass and linen, of paper and ink, of the calendar and the clock, of geometry and the alphabet, the refinement of dress and ornament, of furniture and dwellings, of society and life, the remarkable development of orderly and peaceful government, of census and post, of primary and secondary education, even of technical training for office and administration, the advancement of writing and literature, of science and medicine, the first clear formulation known to us of individual and public conscience, the first cry for social justice, the first widespread monogamy, the first monotheism, the first essays in moral philosophy, the elevation of architecture, sculpture, and the minor arts to a degree of excellence and power never, so far as we know, reached before, and seldom equaled since. These contributions were not lost, even when their finest exemplars were buried under the desert or overthrown by some convulsion of the globe. Through the Phoenicians, the Syrians, and the Jews, through the Cretans, the Greeks, and the Romans, the civilization of Egypt passed down to become part of the cultural heritage of mankind. The effect or remembrance of what Egypt accomplished at the very dawn of history has influence in every nation and every age. It is even possible, as Faure has said, that Egypt, through the solidarity, the unity, and the disciplined variety of its artistic products, through the enormous duration and the sustained power of its effort, offers the spectacle of the greatest civilization that has yet appeared on the earth. We shall do well to equal it. Chapter 9. Babylonia. From Hammurabi to Nebuchadrezzar. Babylonian contributions to modern civilization, the land between the rivers, Hammurabi, his capital, the Kassite domination, the Amarna letters, the Assyrian conquest, Nebuchadrezzar, Babylon in the days of its glory. Civilization, like life, is a perpetual struggle with death, and as life maintains itself only by abandoning old and recasting itself in younger and fresher forms, So civilization achieves a precarious survival by changing its habitat or its blood. It moved from Ur to Babylon and Judea, from Babylon to Nineveh, from these to Persepolis, Sardis, and Miletus, and from these, Egypt and Crete, to Greece and Rome. No one looking at the site of ancient Babylon today would suspect that these hot and dreary wastes along the Euphrates were once the rich and powerful capital of a civilization that almost created astronomy, added richly to the progress of medicine, established the science of language, prepared the first great codes of law, taught the Greeks the rudiments of mathematics, physics, and philosophy, gave the Jews the mythology which they gave to the world, and passed on to the Arabs part of that scientific and architectural lore with which they aroused the dormant soul of medieval Europe. Standing before the silent Tigris and Euphrates, one finds it hard to believe that they are the same rivers that watered Sumeria and Akkad and nourished the hanging gardens of Babylon. In some ways they are not the same rivers, not only because one never steps twice into the same stream, but because these old rivers have long since remade their beds along new courses and mow with their scythes of whiteness other shores. As in Egypt, the Nile, so here the Tigris and the Euphrates provided for thousands of miles an avenue of commerce and, in their southern reaches, springtime inundations that helped the peasant to fertilize his soil. For rain comes to Babylonia only in the winter months. From May to November it comes not at all, and the earth, but for the overflow of the rivers, would be as arid as northern Mesopotamia was then and is today. Through the abundance of the rivers and the toil of many generations of men, Babylonia became the Eden of Semitic legend, the garden and granary of Western Asia. Historically and ethnically, Babylonia was a product of the union of the Akkadians and the Sumerians. Their mating generated the Babylonian type, in which the Akkadian Semitic strain proved dominant. Their warfare ended in the triumph of Akkad and the establishment of Babylon as the capital of all Lower Mesopotamia. At the outset of this history stands the powerful figure of Hammurabi, 2123 to 2081 BC, conqueror and lawgiver through a reign of 43 years. Primeval seals and inscriptions transmit him to us partially, a youth full of fire and genius, a very whirlwind in battle, who crushes all rebels, cuts his enemies into pieces, marches over inaccessible mountains, and never loses an engagement. Under him, the petty warring states of the lower valley were forced into unity and peace, and disciplined into order and security by an historic code of laws. The Code of Hammurabi was unearthed at Susa in 1902, beautifully engraved upon a diorite cylinder that had been carried from Babylon to Elam, circa 1100 BC, as a trophy of war. Like that of Moses, this legislation was a gift from heaven, for one side of the cylinder shows the king receiving the laws from Shamash, the sun god himself. The prologue is almost in heaven. When the lofty Anu, king of the Anunnaki, and Bel, lord of heaven and earth, he who determines the destiny of the land, committed the rule of all mankind to Marduk. When they pronounced the lofty name of Babylon, when they made it famous among the quarters of the world, and in its midst established an everlasting kingdom whose foundations were firm as heaven and earth. At that time Anu and Bel called me, Hammurabi, the exalted prince, the worshipper of the gods, to cause justice to prevail in the land, to destroy the wicked and the evil, to prevent the strong from oppressing the weak, to enlighten the land and to further the welfare of the people. Hammurabi, the governor named by Bel, am I, who brought about plenty and abundance, who made everything for Nippur and Durilu complete, who gave life to the city of Uruk, who supplied water in abundance to its inhabitants, who made the city of Borsippa beautiful, who stored up grain for the mighty Urash, who helped his people in time of need, who establishes in security their property in Babylon, the governor of the people, the servant, whose deeds are pleasing to Anunit. Many of the words here have a modern ring. One would not readily attribute them to an Oriental despot, 2100 BC, or suspect that the laws that they introduced were based upon Sumerian prototypes now 6,000 years old. This book is continued on Cassette 7, Side 1.